The katana blade passes 3 centimeters from Bruce Lee's throat, close enough that he can feel the air displacement from the razor-sharp steel cutting through space where his neck was positioned a fraction of a second earlier. Close enough that the fluorescent lights of the dojo reflect off the polished blade, creating a flash across his vision. Close enough that one miscalculation, one moment of imperfect timing, would have opened his carotid artery and ended his life before anyone could provide medical assistance. Bruce's body has already moved to evade the second cut. His weight shifts, his structure rotates, his positioning adjusts with precision measured in millimeters. The katana's follow-through strike, a horizontal slash aimed at his midsection, passes by his torso with clearance that looks impossibly small to the 7 witnesses watching from the edges of the training floor. The blade's passage creates that distinctive whisper-cut sound, the noise of perfectly forged steel moving through air at speeds that could sever limbs. The samurai executing these strikes is Masahiro Tanaka, 53 years old, 7th Dan Master of Tenshin Shoden Katori Shinto Ryu, one of the oldest surviving samurai traditions in Japan. He holds the katana with the relaxed precision that comes from 45 years of daily practice, from thousands of hours cutting tatami mats and bamboo, from a lifetime devoted to the way of the sword. His blade is not a replica or a practice weapon. It is a genuine shinken, a live blade forged by a traditional swordsmith using methods preserved since the samurai era, sharp enough to cut through bone, deadly enough to kill with the slightest contact. And Bruce Lee is facing this blade unarmed, with nothing but his understanding of distance and timing standing between him and lethal injury. No protective equipment, no safety measures beyond Tanaka's control and Bruce's evasive skill. Just empty hands against the weapon that defined Japanese martial culture for centuries, wielded by someone who has mastered its use at the highest traditional level. To understand how this moment came to exist, how Bruce Lee ended up facing a katana-wielding samurai master in what amounts to a life-or-death demonstration, we need to go back 6 hours to when this evening began in ways nobody anticipated. San Francisco, California, the Nihonmachi district, what locals call Japantown. Early evening, November 1970. The neighborhood exists as a preserved fragment of Japanese culture in America. Blocks of shops selling traditional goods, restaurants serving authentic cuisine, cultural centers maintaining language and customs, dojos where Japanese martial arts are practiced with the same rigor their founders intended. One such dojo occupies the 3rd floor of a building on Post Street. The entrance is marked only by a wooden sign with kanji characters identifying it as Tanaka Dojo, traditional Budo. The staircase leading up is narrow, wooden, each step worn smooth by decades of students climbing to train. The walls display calligraphy scrolls, photographs of previous masters, the aesthetic simplicity that Japanese martial arts spaces favor. The training floor itself is traditional, wooden floor polished to a shine, white walls without decoration beyond a small shrine in one corner, honoring the lineage masters, racks along one wall holding various training weapons. The space smells of wood oil and the particular cleanness that comes from spaces maintained with devotional care. The ceiling is high, allowing for overhead strikes with long weapons. The lighting is soft, creating an atmosphere more contemplative than the harsh fluorescent brightness of commercial gyms. Masahiro Tanaka has operated this dojo for 23 years, teaching traditional Japanese swordsmanship to students who seek authentic training rather than sport kendo or theatrical sword work. His curriculum includes aido, the art of drawing and cutting in single motion, kenjutsu, the techniques of sword fighting, and tameshigiri, test cutting against bamboo and rolled mats to verify that techniques generate real cutting power. Tanaka himself is the inheritor of a samurai tradition that extends back over 500 years. His family were retainers to a daimyo in Chiba Prefecture, serving as sword instructors and bodyguards throughout the Tokugawa shogunate. When the Meiji Restoration abolished the samurai class in 1868, his ancestors preserved their sword arts through private teaching, passing down techniques and philosophy through direct lineage transmission. Tanaka represents the 21st generation of that transmission, one of the last true samurai masters in a world where such skills have become cultural preservation rather than practical necessity. He is 5'9", approximately 170 pounds, his frame showing the particular type of fitness that swordwork develops: strong core, mobile hips, powerful hands and wrists. His hair is graying, his face weathered but sharp, his eyes carrying the focused intensity of someone who has spent a lifetime training awareness and precision. When he moves, whether in daily life or formal practice, every gesture shows economy and purpose, the refinement that comes from eliminating all wasteful motion through decades of deliberate practice. On this particular evening, Tanaka has 7 students present, all Japanese Americans, ranging from a teenager who recently started training to a man in his 60s who has studied with Tanaka for 15 years. They are practicing basic cutting exercises, using bakken wooden swords to refine form before progressing to live blades. The rhythmic sound of their practice fills the dojo, feet sliding across polished floor, controlled breathing accompanying each cut, wooden swords striking the air in synchronized patterns. Bruce Lee is here because of a connection through Dan Inosanto, his close friend and training partner who has been studying Filipino martial arts and Japanese sword work alongside his Jeet Kune Do practice. Inosanto trains with Tanaka occasionally, learning traditional sword principles that inform his understanding of weapons in general. When Inosanto mentioned that Tanaka would be interested in meeting Bruce and discussing the relationship between empty hands and weapons from different cultural perspectives, Bruce accepted the invitation with genuine interest. Bruce arrives at 6:30, climbing the worn stairs to the dojo, carrying the homage gift that Inosanto advised, a bottle of quality sake, the appropriate gesture when visiting a traditional Japanese teacher. He removes his shoes at the entrance, bows to the shrine, approaches Tanaka with the formal respect that Japanese martial culture requires. Tanaka receives the gift with a bow of equal depth, then gestures for Bruce to sit. They observe the students' practice in silence for several minutes, the traditional Japanese approach to initial meetings where much communication happens through shared observation rather than immediate conversation. Bruce watches the cutting exercises with analytical attention, seeing the precision in the student's form, the sophisticated understanding of body mechanics that proper sword work requires. When the students finish their formal practice and begin cooling down, Tanaka finally speaks in careful English. Inosanto-san speaks highly of your understanding. He says you have studied many fighting arts, synthesized them into something new. This is an unusual approach for traditional martial artists, but perhaps valuable in modern context. Thank you for receiving me, Tanaka-sensei, Bruce responds, using the Japanese title of respect. I have great admiration for traditional sword arts, the precision, the discipline, the philosophical depth. These represent centuries of refined knowledge. What I practice builds on traditional foundations, but attempts to evolve them for different purposes than historical preservation. Different purposes, Tanaka repeats thoughtfully. You mean practical fighting effectiveness in modern contexts, not preservation of classical forms? Yes, Bruce confirms. Traditional arts like your sword work were developed for specific historical needs. Samurai combat, battlefield scenarios, dueling culture. Those contexts rarely exist now. What I'm exploring is how to take principles from traditional arts and apply them to contemporary self-defense situations where the opponent might not follow traditional fighting patterns. Tanaka considers this carefully. In traditional Japanese martial arts, particularly classical sword schools like his, innovation is often viewed with suspicion. The forms have been passed down unchanged for generations, specifically because the ancestors who created them were testing them in actual combat, refining them through life and death experience. Changing those forms implies either arrogance, believing you know better than warriors who survived actual battles, or misunderstanding of why the forms exist as they do. But Tanaka is also intelligent enough to recognize that contexts change, that what worked for samurai facing other samurai might need adaptation for modern self-defense. The question is whether Bruce's synthesis represents genuine evolution or just abandonment of hard-won traditional knowledge for superficial innovation. In sword arts, Tanaka says, we have saying, the sword that has tasted blood knows truth that practiced sword cannot understand. Our forms come from ancestors whose swords tasted blood many times, who refined techniques through actual combat where mistakes meant death. When you innovate, when you change traditional methods, how do you verify that your innovations are not just untested theories? It's a profound question, and Bruce respects its depth. I test through sparring and real application when possible. But you're correct that I haven't faced life-or-death sword combat. My innovations in empty-hand fighting have been tested in real situations, but weapon work is different. I study traditional weapon arts to understand principles that have been verified through actual use, then try to apply those principles in modern contexts while acknowledging I haven't tested them under the same conditions the ancestors did. Would you be willing to test against traditional sword work? Tanaka asks, his voice casual, but his intention serious. Not to prove superiority of either approach, but to honestly explore whether empty-hand understanding developed through modern training can handle weapons mastered through traditional methods? Bruce understands immediately what Tanaka is proposing. Not sparring with practice weapons, not theoretical discussion, but actual testing where Bruce's empty-hand skills face Tanaka's sword work under conditions that simulate real danger. The proposal carries significant risk. Swords cut, mistakes cause injuries, the margin for error is minimal. But Bruce also recognizes this as an opportunity. He's faced weapons before, has developed understanding of how to manage distance and timing against armed opponents. But he's never faced a true swordmaster, someone whose weapon work represents the absolute peak of traditional development. Testing against Tanaka would verify whether his principles work against the highest level of weapons mastery, or whether traditional sword arts truly are overwhelming advantage against empty hands, as many classical practitioners claim. I'm willing, Bruce agrees, but we should establish safety parameters. What did you have in mind? If you're watching this story develop and recognizing that Bruce Lee is about to face a samurai master's real katana with nothing but his empty hand skills and the trust that Tanaka's control will stop short of actually cutting him, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This moment becomes one of the most dangerous and philosophically profound encounters in Bruce's life. Not a sport contest or friendly sparring, but genuine testing where one miscalculation from either man could result in lethal injury. Subscribe to see how empty hands handle the weapon that defined an entire warrior culture. Tanaka's proposal is specific and carefully considered. I will use my shinken, my live blade. Not practice sword, not blunted weapon. Real katana, properly sharpened, capable of cutting. But I will use control, cutting with intent and full speed, stopping millimeters from actual contact. This simulates real danger while minimizing injury risk. Your task is to evade or control my attacks using empty hand techniques. We continue until either you are touched by the blade or until I judge that your understanding is sufficient to handle sword work legitimately. The 7 students who have been cooling down are now listening intently. What their sensei just proposed goes beyond normal training, enters the realm of actual testing where the traditional methods they practice will be verified against a completely different approach to combat. Several of them look concerned. The shinken their sensei uses for tameshigiri test cutting can sever bamboo poles with single stroke. Against human flesh, it would cut through muscle and bone with terrifying ease. Bruce processes the proposal's implications. Tanaka is offering to attack with real sword technique, with actual cutting intention and speed, trusting that his control will stop the blade before it makes contact. This places enormous faith in Tanaka's precision and in Bruce's evasive ability. If Tanaka's control fails even slightly, Bruce gets cut. If Bruce's timing is imperfect, he moves into the blade rather than away from it. The margins are so small that most martial artists would refuse this test as unnecessarily dangerous. But Bruce also understands that real testing requires real stakes. Facing practice weapons with cooperative partners doesn't verify whether your understanding works under pressure, whether your techniques function when actual danger focuses the mind completely. Tanaka is offering honest verification under conditions that approximate real combat's intensity without guaranteed fatal outcome. I accept your terms, Bruce says, but I request one modification. Instead of stopping when the blade touches me, stop when it becomes clear whether I can handle your attacks consistently. One touch might be luck, mine or yours. Multiple exchanges show whether the understanding is real. Tanaka nods approval at this modification. Agreed. We will test through multiple attack sequences. This reveals patterns, shows whether your evasion is reactive luck or strategic understanding. They prepare the space. Students move to the walls, giving maximum room for the testing. Tanaka retrieves his katana from its stand, a traditional blade in a simple black saya scabbard, the tsuka handle wrapped in white silk over ray skin, the tsuba guard showing the wear patterns of 45 years of use. He draws the blade with formal ceremony, the distinctive ring of steel leaving the scabbard filling the dojo with sound that has marked the beginning of sword practice for centuries. The blade itself is beautiful in the way traditional Japanese swords are beautiful. Subtle curve, visible hum and temper line along the edge, steel that shows the folding patterns from the forging process. But the beauty is entirely functional. Every aspect of the sword's design serves the purpose of cutting efficiently. The curve allows drawing and cutting in single motion. The differential tempering creates edge that holds sharpness while spine that absorbs impact. The balance point sits just forward of the tsuba, making the sword feel light in hand despite being heavy enough to cut through substantial targets. Tanaka moves through several practice cuts, warming up the specific muscles that sword work engages, verifying the blade's edge alignment, settling into the mental state that sword combat requires. His cuts are precise, controlled, each one following the classical form his lineage teaches. The blade moves through space with that distinctive whisper, the sound of perfectly maintained steel cutting air cleanly. Bruce watches these practice cuts carefully, analyzing the patterns. Tanaka's sword work follows classical kenjutsu principles, cutting from specific guards, moving through defined angles, executing techniques that generations of samurai refined. The form is beautiful, but form creates patterns, and patterns can be exploited if you understand the principles underlying them. They face each other in the center of the dojo floor, perhaps 10 feet apart. Tanaka settles into Chudan no Kamae, middle guard position, blade held at waist level pointing toward Bruce's throat. This is the fundamental guard in most Japanese sword schools, balanced between offense and defense, allowing quick response to any attack or opportunity. Bruce stands naturally, no formal stance, his hands relaxed at his sides. To the students watching, trained in traditional forms, Bruce's positioning looks vulnerable, unprepared. They're accustomed to seeing fighters settle into defined guards that signal readiness. Bruce's casualness seems to indicate he doesn't understand the danger he's facing. But Tanaka, with decades of experience reading opponents, sees something different. Bruce's apparent casualness is complete readiness. His weight is perfectly balanced, allowing instant movement in any direction. His hands, while looking relaxed, are positioned where they can react immediately to threats. His eyes are focused on Tanaka's center, not on the sword, seeing the hole rather than fixating on the weapon. Tanaka initiates without warning or signal, moving from stillness to full-speed attack in the way classical swordwork teaches. No preparation, no telegraph, just instant committed cutting. The blade comes up and over in Kesagiri diagonal cut, aimed to strike from Bruce's left shoulder down across his torso. If the cut completed, it would open his chest cavity. Bruce's body rotates and shifts. The blade passes through space his shoulder occupied an instant earlier. The cut is so close that it slices the fabric of Bruce's shirt without touching skin, a line appearing in the cloth that shows exactly how small the margin was. Tanaka continues flowing directly into second cut, Yokogiri horizontal, slash at midsection level. Classical swordwork emphasizes continuous attacking, using the sword's momentum from one cut to fuel the next, creating sequences that overwhelm defensive responses through sheer commitment and precision. Bruce's body drops into low stance, passing under the horizontal cut. The blade whistles over his head with perhaps 2 inches of clearance. He doesn't try to block or deflect against a properly executed sword cut. Attempting to block with empty hands results in losing the hands. Instead, he evades, managing distance and positioning so the blade passes through spaces he's already vacated. Tanaka executes 5 more cuts in rapid sequence, diagonal, horizontal, vertical, each one following classical form perfectly, each one aimed with lethal intent, speed at full combat tempo. Bruce evades all of them, his movements minimal, economical, precise. He's not running away, not creating large distances. He's maintaining engagement range while constantly adjusting position so that Tanaka's blade finds nothing but air. After this initial sequence, Tanaka steps back, resetting to Chudan guard. Both men are breathing slightly harder, Tanaka from the exertion of executing full-speed cuts with a 3-pound blade, Bruce from the mental intensity of evading attacks that could kill him with single mistake. You evade well, Tanaka acknowledges, but evasion alone is incomplete. Real sword combat requires ability to create counterattack opportunities. Just surviving cuts is defensive, reactive. Can you move from defense to offense against the sword? Bruce nods understanding. May I move closer? May I attempt to control your weapon or create striking opportunities? Yes, Tanaka agrees. Show me how empty hands handle sword when permitted to counter, not just evade. They reset. Same initial positioning. This time when Tanaka attacks with Kesagiri diagonal cut, Bruce doesn't just evade, he moves inside the cut's arc, closer to Tanaka rather than away, entering the range where the sword hasn't fully accelerated. His hand moves toward Tanaka's forearm, not to grab the blade itself, but to control the arm wielding it. Tanaka's swordwork is too refined for this to succeed easily. He adjusts mid-cut, rotates his body to prevent Bruce's hand from establishing control, flows into second cut from a different angle. But Bruce's attempt forced Tanaka to adjust, disrupted the classical pattern, created moment of uncertainty. They exchange this way for several minutes. Tanaka attacking with traditional sword patterns, Bruce evading while attempting to close distance and control. Neither man fully succeeds in their objective. Tanaka can't touch Bruce with the blade. Bruce can't fully control Tanaka's weapon. They're locked in chess match of distance and timing, each adjustment creating new situation requiring new response. Before I continue with what happens as this testing intensifies, as both men push toward the limits of their understanding while separated from injury by only millimeters and perfect control, I need to know you're feeling the weight of this encounter. Drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and whether this demonstration is revealing something profound about the relationship between traditional weapons mastery and empty hand evolution, about what happens when absolute commitment to different approaches meets in honest testing. Because what unfolds in the next phase transforms both men's understanding of their arts while the 7 witnesses watch something they'll carry for the rest of their lives. Tanaka changes his approach. Instead of flowing attacks from classical patterns, he begins fighting more spontaneously, using broken rhythm and irregular timing that makes his cuts less predictable. The sword comes from angles that don't follow textbook sequences, mixing feints with real cuts, creating uncertainty about which strikes have true commitment behind them. This adaptation shows Tanaka's depth. He's not just executing forms mindlessly, he's applying sword principles adaptively, using his decades of experience to find counters for Bruce's defensive patterns. When Bruce moves to evade high cuts, Tanaka's sword drops low. When Bruce closes distance, Tanaka creates space. When Bruce settles into defensive rhythm, Tanaka breaks that rhythm with irregular timing. Bruce handles this adaptation by shifting his own approach. Instead of reacting to each individual cut, he starts reading Tanaka's overall strategy, seeing patterns in the adaptations themselves. When Tanaka feints high to cut low, Bruce recognizes the feint from Tanaka's weight distribution before the sword fully commits. When Tanaka creates space, Bruce doesn't chase. He controls the distance, maintaining ranges where his empty hands have options. The testing becomes increasingly sophisticated. What started as verification of basic principles evolves into high-level exchange where both men are operating at the peak of their respective arts. Tanaka's sword work represents 500 years of refined samurai tradition. Bruce's empty hand understanding represents decades of cross-training synthesis. Both are legitimate expressions of combat mastery, different paths to the same goal of effective fighting. After perhaps 10 minutes of continuous exchange, both men are breathing hard, both showing signs of genuine exertion. Tanaka calls a pause, both combatants stepping back to neutral distance. The 7 students watching have been silent throughout, transfixed by seeing their teacher, who they've always known as essentially invincible with his sword, unable to touch an unarmed opponent despite full-speed attacks with live blade. Your understanding is legitimate, Tanaka acknowledges, his voice showing the exertion, but also the respect. You manage distance and timing at level that creates genuine problems for sword work. This is not beginner's luck. This is sophisticated understanding applied consistently. And your sword work is exceptional, Bruce responds with equal respect. Every cut is technically perfect, your recovery is immediate, your adaptation is intelligent. You've proven that traditional training properly done creates real capability. But you've also shown me where sword work, despite its lethality, has limitations that empty-hand understanding can exploit. What limitations do you see? Tanaka asks, genuinely interested in analysis from someone who just survived his attacks. Distance dependency, Bruce explains. The sword requires specific distance to function optimally. Too far and it can't reach. Too close and it can't generate cutting power. I've been managing engagement range to stay at distances where your sword is disadvantaged while my hands remain functional. Pattern constraint, Bruce continues. Even with your adaptive fighting, the sword must move through certain basic angles to cut effectively. Up, down, diagonal, horizontal. These are the primary cutting paths that physics allows. Your variations are sophisticated, but they still operate within boundaries that body mechanics and blade design create. Understanding those boundaries allows predicting general areas where the blade will be, even if precise timing remains uncertain. Recovery time, Bruce adds. When you commit to a full power cut and miss, the sword's momentum requires time to recover and reset. That recovery time creates windows where you're vulnerable to counterattack. I haven't exploited those windows fully because doing so would require actually striking you, which seems inappropriate for this testing. But in real combat, those recovery moments would be critical opportunities. Tanaka absorbs this analysis, finding truth in each point. These are limitations I know exist, but rarely confront, because most opponents don't have sophisticated enough understanding to exploit them. Against students or even many experienced martial artists, the sword's advantages, reach, power, lethality, overwhelm these limitations. But against someone with your level of understanding, the limitations become significant. May I now show you what I observe about your empty-hand approach? Tanaka asks. Exchange should be mutual. You've pointed out swordwork's limitations. I should share what I see as empty hands' vulnerabilities. Bruce nods, interested in this perspective from someone who has just tested him extensively. First, Tanaka begins, your evasion requires perfect timing. One mistake, one moment of imperfect distance judgment, and the cut connects. The sword forgives nothing. Your approach gives you no margin for error, whereas my sword work has margin. If my cut is slightly off target, I can recover and attack again. Your defense must be perfect consistently, which creates mental pressure that accumulates over time. Second, Tanaka continues, you manage distance excellently against single opponent with single weapon. But sword combat historically often involved multiple opponents or unpredictable environments. Your empty hand method seems optimized for controlled situations. Adding variables, uneven ground, obstacles, multiple attackers would create significant challenges for your approach. Third, Tanaka observes, your technique requires exceptional physical attributes, speed, precision, awareness. As you age, these attributes will decline. My sword work, while also requiring skill, can compensate for physical decline through technique and timing in ways that empty-hand fighting cannot. A 70-year-old swordsman can still cut effectively. A 70-year-old relying on evasive speed faces more limitations. Bruce receives this criticism with the same openness he expects from others. All of your observations are valid. My approach does require near-perfect execution under pressure. It is optimized for situations I'm most likely to face, usually single opponent in relatively controlled environment. And you're correct that physical decline will eventually limit my effectiveness in ways that might not limit weapon-based arts. These are real limitations I need to address in my training and teaching. The exchange has evolved from testing into mutual teaching, both men sharing insights that enhance rather than diminish each other's understanding. The 7 students watching are absorbing lessons about martial arts that their normal training never provides, that different approaches have different strengths and limitations, that mastery in one area doesn't preclude learning from others, that honest testing reveals truths that theoretical discussion cannot. Tanaka sheaths his katana with formal ceremony, the blade sliding into the saya with the practiced precision of someone who has performed this action tens of thousands of times. He bows to Bruce, a deep bow that shows genuine respect rather than mere courtesy. "Would you be willing to train with my students occasionally?" Tanaka asks. "To show them the empty-hand understanding you've developed? Not to replace their sword work, but to enhance it. To help them understand how opponents might counter traditional techniques, to show them what sophisticated empty-hand fighting looks like so they can develop strategies to address it." "I would be honored," Bruce accepts. "And I would ask permission to continue training with you occasionally, to deepen my understanding of sword work. The more I understand traditional weapons, the better I can develop empty-hand methods that account for them." They agree to this exchange. Bruce will visit the dojo monthly, working with Tanaka's students on empty-hand principles that help them understand how opponents might counter sword techniques. Tanaka will teach Bruce sword work fundamentals, not trying to make him a swordsman, but helping him understand the weapon deeply enough to develop more sophisticated empty-hand counters. Over the next 2 years, this exchange produces results for both sides. Tanaka's students' sword work becomes more strategic, more aware of limitations, more adaptable when facing opponents who don't follow classical patterns. Several of them compete in modern kendo tournaments and perform unusually well because they've learned to adapt traditional techniques to less predictable opposition. Bruce's understanding of weapons deepens significantly. Working with Tanaka teaches him nuances about sword combat that casual weapons study never revealed. How recovery timing creates opportunities, how blade angles limit attack options, how different grips and guards create different vulnerabilities. This knowledge informs his Jeet Kune Do teaching, making his weapons defense concepts more sophisticated and better grounded in understanding of how traditional weapons actually function. That's the truth 7 witnesses observed at Tanaka Dojo in 1970. That Bruce Lee, completely unarmed, could face a samurai master's real katana for extended testing without the blade ever touching him. That empty-hand understanding, developed through modern synthesis, could handle traditional weapons mastery when tested honestly. That both approaches have value, both have limitations, both serve understanding better when they inform each other rather than oppose each other. If this story revealed something about the relationship between traditional weapons and modern empty-hand arts, about how honest testing creates mutual respect rather than competition, subscribe so you never miss these deeper truths. Comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what this taught you about weapons versus empty hands, about tradition versus innovation, about how real mastery includes knowing your limitations and learning from anyone who can expand your understanding. The story of Bruce facing Tanaka's katana spreads through martial arts communities on the West Coast, growing and changing as stories do. Some versions claim Bruce disarmed the samurai and turned his own sword against him. Other versions say Tanaka deliberately pulled his cuts, that the testing wasn't genuine. A few versions insist Bruce was actually cut but continued fighting anyway. The 7 witnesses, when asked, tell more nuanced truth. They describe both men operating at the highest level of their respective arts. They emphasize the mutual respect that developed, the teaching that emerged from testing, the recognition that different approaches to combat can both be valid while having different strengths and limitations. One student, now in his 70s, remembers it this way. Sensei was trying to cut him, really trying, with full speed and proper form. But Bruce-san was never where the sword was cutting. It was like watching water flow around rocks. The sword kept finding empty spaces because Bruce moved with such perfect timing that he was always somewhere else. Not far away, just slightly out of range. After that night, Sensei started teaching us differently. He still emphasized classical form, but he also taught us to think about what opponents might do if they didn't follow classical patterns, how to adapt when traditional techniques encountered unexpected responses. Tanaka himself, before his death in 2003, wrote briefly about the encounter in a private journal that his son later shared with martial arts historians. The entry reads, "Tested my sword against Bruce Lee tonight. He evaded everything I cut with, showed sophisticated understanding of distance and timing. I had believed sword work, properly executed, could overwhelm any empty-hand technique. Lee proved this belief incomplete. The sword remains formidable, especially against untrained opponents. But against someone with his level of understanding, the sword's advantages are not guaranteed victory. This is humbling but valuable lesson. Traditional training must evolve to account for what modern practitioners have developed, or we preserve only forms without maintaining the combat effectiveness our ancestors achieved by constantly testing and refining their methods." Bruce incorporated the Tanaka experience into his teaching frequently. When students asked about weapons defense, he would describe facing the katana, explain what made it dangerous, detail what principles allowed surviving against it. He emphasized that weapons provide real advantages that should never be underestimated, but that those advantages create dependencies and patterns that sophisticated understanding can exploit. He also used the experience to teach about respect for tradition. Tanaka-sensei represents 500 years of refined knowledge, Bruce told his students. His swordwork is not obsolete, not inferior to modern methods. It's different, optimized for different contexts based on different historical needs. But the principles underlying it, distance management, timing, commitment to attack, these are universal. Respecting traditional arts means understanding what they developed, why they developed it, and how those lessons apply even when contexts change. The seven witnesses carried the lessons differently. Some focused on the physical impossibility of what they saw, the perfect evasion that seemed to defy natural human reaction time. Others absorbed the philosophical lessons about tradition and innovation coexisting. All of them maintained that what they observed was genuine testing under dangerous conditions that proved principles both men claimed to understand. One witness became a sword instructor himself, eventually opening his own dojo. He teaches traditional Japanese swordwork, but also incorporates awareness training about empty-hand counters, having learned from watching Bruce that traditional forms, while valuable, can become rigid if practitioners never face opponents who fight differently. His students are among the most successful in competition because they've learned to adapt classical techniques to unpredictable opposition. A real katana, wielded by a master, is one of the most lethal weapons ever developed. Optimized through centuries of refinement, capable of cutting through flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency, backed by martial traditions that produced some of history's most effective warriors. Bruce Lee faced this weapon unarmed, with nothing but his understanding standing between him and potentially fatal injury. The blade never touched him. Not because Tanaka held back. The seven witnesses agree the attacks were genuine, full speed, properly formed. Not because Bruce possessed supernatural abilities, his evasions followed natural principles of distance and timing, but because his understanding of combat principles was developed deeply enough, refined carefully enough, tested honestly enough, that even against the absolute peak of traditional weapons mastery, he could function effectively. 7 people witnessed it. 7 people carry the memory of seeing impossibility become reality through mastery. 7 people learned that night that weapons and empty hands, tradition and innovation, classical forms and modern synthesis can all coexist, can all inform each other, can all serve the larger goal of understanding combat more completely. That the question isn't whether one approach is superior, but how different approaches can enhance each other when practitioners are wise enough to learn across boundaries rather than defend them.